I was 72 years old, standing in front of a rusted gate I swore I'd never open again. When I realized that some secrets don't die with the people who keep them, they just wait in the ground, patient as the dirt itself, for someone to dig them up. The chain I just cut through fell to the dust with a sound like breaking bones. 40 years since I'd last set foot on this land, and now here I was, a widow with shaking hands and a letter from my dead husband that had led me right back to the place we'd abandoned in shame. The gate groaned open, and I swear it sounded like the ranch itself waking up from a long, angry sleep. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, and sadder. The fence posts leaned like old men too tired to stand straight. The main house sagged to one side, its paint peeled down to bare wood gone gray as ash. That barn where Howard and I used to dance to the radio on Saturday nights, half its roof had caved in, leaving jagged edges pointing at the sky like broken teeth. But it was the silence that got to me most. No cattle lowing, no chickens fussing, no sound of Howard's boots on the porch calling me in for supper. Just wind moving through dead grass, making it whisper secrets I couldn't quite hear. His letter had been tucked inside his will, written in that shaky handwriting he developed in his last years. Maggie, it said, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone home. There's something I never told you, something I buried long before we left the ranch. Go there, open the gate, and forgive me for what you find. Have you ever gotten news that made you question everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? Drop a comment and let me know, because what I found behind that gate changed 50 years of marriage in a single afternoon. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. We'd been married 50 years. I thought I knew every corner of Howard Langston's heart. Turns out I didn't know a damn thing. I started walking toward the barn, my boots crunching on dirt so dry it had cracked into puzzle pieces. This land had been in Howard's family since 1958. He loved this place the way some men love women, with his whole chest, his whole life, until 1983. Until everything fell apart and we packed up in the middle of the night like criminals running from a crime scene, our 12-year-old son Calvin crying in the back seat, asking why we had to leave. Howard never gave him an answer, just kept his jaw set and his eyes on the road and said, some land ain't meant to forgive, Maggie. Best we forget it ever existed. But he never forgot. He carried this place with him every single day for 40 years. And now he'd sent me back to find out why. As I got closer to the barn, something caught my eye, a glint of metal near the entrance, bright against all that weathered wood. I stopped dead. It was a padlock. A brand new one, still shiny, lying in the dirt like someone had cut it off and tossed it aside. My heart started hammering. Someone had been here. Recently. I stood there frozen, listening hard. Everything had gone still. And then, from inside the barn, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across wood. Or like someone trying very hard not to make any noise at all. The scraping sound stopped the second I stepped inside the barn, which somehow made it worse. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet, and all I could see were shapes and shadows playing tricks on my mind. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming short and fast, and that's when I remembered I'd left my phone in the car. Stupid. So stupid. But then the wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards, and I realized what I'd heard. Just the barn settling. Just old wood talking to itself the way old things do. My racing heart started to slow down, and I felt foolish standing there terrified of ghosts and memories. I waited for my eyes to adjust, and slowly the barn came into focus. The mound of dirt in the corner looked darker than the soil around it, fresher somehow. And that tin box sticking out of it, that was real. That wasn't my imagination. I should tell you about the letter. About how I found it 3 days after we buried Howard in the cemetery plot we'd bought 15 years ago, back when we still thought we had plenty of time left together. The funeral had been small. Calvin came down from Seattle with his wife and kids. A few neighbors showed up. Howard's poker buddies from the VFW. The pastor said nice things about a man he barely knew, and we all pretended that made it better somehow. Afterward, Calvin and I sat in my living room sorting through paperwork, and that's when the lawyer arrived with Howard's will. Standard stuff mostly. The house went to me, his savings split between me and Calvin, his truck to his grandson. But then the lawyer handed me a separate envelope, sealed with wax like something from another century. Mr. Langston was very specific, the lawyer said. This was to be given to you privately, after the reading of the will. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was Howard's letter, written on the back of an old feed store receipt, dated 2 weeks before he died. He must have known the cancer was winning. Must have known he was running out of time to tell me whatever secret he'd been carrying. I read those words over and over until I had them memorized. There's something I never told you, something I buried long before we left the ranch. What could possibly be buried out here that was worth dragging a 72-year-old widow back to the scene of the worst year of her life? Calvin wanted to come with me. Mom, you can't drive 6 hours alone, he'd said. And you definitely shouldn't be going back to that place by yourself. Let me come. Let me help. But I couldn't. This was between me and Howard. Between me and whatever truth he'd been too scared or too ashamed to tell me while he was alive. So I'd lied to my son. Told him I was just going to check on the property, maybe meet with a real estate agent about finally selling it. He'd looked relieved, like he was glad to be rid of that piece of our family history. If only he knew. I read the letter one more time before I left, searching for clues I might have missed. Forgive me for what you find. What did that mean? Forgive him for keeping a secret? Or forgive him for whatever that secret was? The drive out had taken 6 hours, just like I remembered. The highway narrowed into state roads, then county roads, then finally that dusty track that led to our gate. I'd stopped for gas in Maryville, the little town where we used to buy supplies, and I didn't recognize a single face. Everyone we'd known was either dead or gone. The woman at the cash register was young, maybe 25, with a baby on her hip and tired eyes. She didn't know the Langston name. Didn't know about the ranch or the scandal or any of it. To her, I was just another old lady passing through. That's when it really hit me how completely we'd disappeared from this place. How thoroughly Howard had erased us from the map. And now he was sending me back like some kind of archaeologist, digging up bones that should have stayed buried. I'd parked at the gate because I didn't trust the driveway not to swallow my car whole. Cut through that chain with bolt cutters I'd bought special for this trip. Walked onto land that used to be ours and felt like a trespasser in my own history. And now here I stood in this barn, staring at that mound of dirt, trying to decide if I had the courage to dig up whatever Howard had hidden there. The thing is, I'd trusted that man with my whole life. Trusted him when he said we had to leave the ranch. Trusted him when he said we'd be okay in the city, even though I could see him dying a little more every day away from this land. Trusted him when he refused to talk about what happened with his sister Ruth, even though her betrayal had carved a hole right through the center of our marriage. But trust is a funny thing. It can last 50 years and still shatter in a single moment when you realize the person you loved had a whole other life you knew nothing about. I took a step toward that mound of dirt, then another, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a second set of footprints in the dust, smaller than the first, leading from the barn door straight to where I was standing now. Someone else knew about Howard's secret, and they'd been here looking for it just hours before I arrived. The highway stretched out in front of me like a scar across the earth, and with every mile I drove, I kept asking myself what I was doing. 72 years old, chasing ghosts through the desert, following a dead man's cryptic instructions to a place that held nothing but bad memories and broken dreams. But I couldn't stop. That letter had gotten under my skin like a splinter, the kind you can't see, but can feel with every movement. There's something I buried long before we left the ranch. The words played on loop in my head, keeping time with the thrum of tires on asphalt. I'd left at dawn, watching the city shrink in my rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of light against the dark sky. The drive gave me too much time to think, too much time to remember things I'd spent 40 years trying to forget. Like the day we first saw the ranch, back in 1971. Howard had inherited it from his father, and we drove out with baby Calvin strapped in his car seat, both of us young and stupid, and convinced we could make anything work if we just loved each other hard enough. The place was a disaster then, too, run down, neglected, barely holding together. But Howard saw something I couldn't. He walked those fields like he was walking through a cathedral, touching fence posts like they were holy relics, talking about his granddaddy who'd built the original house with his bare hands during the Depression. "This land has Langston blood in it, Maggie," he'd said, pulling me close, pointing at the horizon where the sun was setting in colors that looked painted on. "Our son's gonna grow up here. Our grandkids too. This is forever." Forever lasted 12 years. The road narrowed as I got closer, civilization falling away in chunks. First the strip malls disappeared, then the gas stations, then even the billboards stopped trying to sell me things I didn't need. Just desert and sky, and the occasional farmhouse sitting alone like a ship in an empty ocean. I passed through Maryville around noon, barely recognizing it. The old feed store where Howard used to buy supplies had been turned into an antique shop. The diner where we'd celebrated Calvin's birthdays was boarded up, windows so painted with going out of business signs that looked years old. This whole area was dying, had been dying for decades. Young people left for cities where there were jobs and futures. Old people held on until they couldn't anymore, then their kids sold everything and scattered like seeds on the wind. We'd been part of that exodus. Part of the great giving up. I stopped for coffee at the only place still open, a gas station that looked held together by rust and prayer. The man behind the counter was ancient, his face folded into creases deep as canyons. He rang me up without making eye contact, and I was grateful. I didn't want to explain who I was, or why I'd come back. But as I was leaving, he said, "You heading out to the old Langston place?" I froze with my hand on the door. "How did you know?" He shrugged, still not looking at me. "Only reason anyone takes that road anymore. Been seeing cars out there last few days. Thought maybe the bank finally got around to selling it." "What cars?" My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. "Silver SUV mainly. City plates. Saw it headed out there yesterday, day before that too." He finally met my eyes, and something in his expression made me uncomfortable. "You be careful out there, ma'am. That land's got a bad history." I wanted to ask what he meant, but I didn't. I already knew our history. I didn't need some stranger's version of it. The last 20 miles were the worst. The road turned to dirt, then to barely a road, pocked with holes that rattled my teeth and made me grip the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Dust rose up around my car like smoke, coating everything, getting in my throat. And then I saw it. That wooden sign, crooked and faded but still readable. Langston Ranch, EST 1958. I stopped the car right there in the middle of the road and just stared. The flood of 1963 had nearly wiped us out. Water came down from the mountains without warning, turning our peaceful creek into a raging monster that swallowed half our herd and destroyed the barn. Howard and I worked for months rebuilding, both of us sunburned and exhausted and too stubborn to quit. Those were good times, in a strange way. Hard, but good. We were young enough to believe that work could solve anything, that if we just kept pushing, kept fighting, we'd come out the other side stronger.
We'd been wrong about that too.
Ruth showed up in 1982, right when things started falling apart financially. Howard's sister, older than him by 6 years, twice divorced, always needing something. She came bearing offers of help that felt more like threats. "I've got money from Mama's estate," she'd said, sitting at our kitchen table, stirring sugar into coffee she never drank. "I could loan you enough to get through this rough patch." Family helping family. Howard had said no. Politely at first, then more firmly when she kept pushing. I remember the way her face changed, how something cold moved behind her eyes. 2 weeks later, the rumors started. Howard was gambling. Howard was drinking away the ranch money. Howard was cheating on his wife with a woman in town. None of it was true, but truth doesn't matter much when people want to believe the worst about you. We left in August 1983, in the middle of the night, because Howard couldn't face seeing our neighbors in daylight. Couldn't face their judgment, their pity, their satisfaction at seeing the proud Langston boy brought low. He never told me what really happened. Never explained why we had to run instead of fight. Just said some things couldn't be fixed and we needed to move on. But you can't move on from something that's still chasing you. The gate stood in front of me now, chained shut, exactly as we'd left it 40 years ago. The same horseshoe hung from the post, probably for luck that never came. I got out of my car and approached it slowly, the way you'd approach a sleeping animal you weren't sure was friendly. My hand touched the chain, cold despite the afternoon heat, and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite fear, not quite grief. Something older and deeper that didn't have a name. That's when I noticed the padlock at the barn was new.
Shiny.
Recently cut. And behind me, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of cigarette smoke that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. I slept in my car that first night because I couldn't bring myself to go inside the house. Through the windshield, I watched the ranch settle into darkness, every shadow becoming a memory I didn't want to face. The truck seat wasn't comfortable. Nothing about this situation was comfortable, but at least out here, I could see what was coming. The house had too many rooms, too many corners where the past could hide and jump out at me. Out here, with the doors locked and my phone within reach, I felt almost safe. Almost. Every sound made me flinch. The wind rattling something loose on the barn roof. An animal moving through the brush nearby, probably a coyote or a fox. The distant hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. Normal night sounds, the kind I used to fall asleep to when we lived here, but now they felt like warnings. I kept thinking about those footprints in the barn. About what the gas station attendant had said about a silver SUV. About Howard's letter asking for forgiveness. What had he done? Around midnight, I dozed off without meaning to, my head against the window, and that's when the dream started. Howard was standing at the gate, young again, wearing the blue shirt I'd bought him for our first anniversary. He was calling my name, but no sound came out of his mouth. He kept pointing toward the barn, his face urgent, desperate, trying to tell me something. Then Ruth appeared behind him, older, grayer, her hand on his shoulder like a claw. She smiled at me, and her teeth were black as coal. I jerked awake with my heart hammering, the dream already fading but leaving behind a sick feeling in my stomach. The clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m. The loneliest hour of the night, when nothing feels real and everything feels possible. Through the windshield, the barn looked different than it had earlier. Darker somehow, even though nothing had changed. Just my imagination playing tricks, I told myself. Just an old woman jumping at shadows. But then I saw it, a faint glow coming from inside the barn, visible through the gaps in the walls. Not bright, just a flicker, there and gone, like someone had turned on a flashlight and then quickly turned it off. I sat frozen, my breath fogging up the windows, watching that barn like it was a living thing that might stand up and walk away. Minutes passed.
5. 10.
The glow didn't come back. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just moonlight reflecting off something metal. Maybe I was losing my mind out here alone with ghosts and secrets. Or maybe someone else was in that barn right now, digging up whatever Howard had buried. The smart thing would have been to start the car and drive away, find a motel in Maryville, come back in the morning with the sheriff. But I didn't do the smart thing. I never had, and apparently 72 years hadn't made me any wiser. I got out of the car as quietly as I could, leaving the door open so it wouldn't make that slamming sound. The night air was cold, much colder than the day had been, and I wished I'd brought a heavier coat. I wished I'd brought a lot of things, courage mainly. The walk to the barn felt like it took hours. Every step crunched on the dry ground, sounding impossibly loud in the silence. I kept waiting for something to happen, for someone to jump out, for lights to come on, for the universe to give me some sign that I should turn back. But nothing happened. I made it to the barn door without incident, and that almost made it worse. I stood there listening, my ear pressed against the rough wood. At first, I heard nothing. Then, very faintly, I heard breathing. Not my own breathing. Someone else's, coming from inside. Howard. The name came out of my mouth before I could stop it, a whisper that sounded pathetically hopeful even to my own ears. The breathing stopped. For a moment, everything went perfectly still, and I had time to realize what a mistake I'd made. Then the barn door exploded outward, catching me in the shoulder and knocking me flat on my back in the dirt. I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me, and by the time I could breathe again, whoever had been inside was gone. I lay there gasping, staring up at stars I hadn't seen in 40 years, and I heard an engine start somewhere in the distance. Not close, maybe parked out on the road where I wouldn't notice it. A vehicle door slammed, and then the sound of tires on dirt, getting fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely. It took me a few minutes to get up. My shoulder throbbed where the door had hit it, and I was pretty sure I'd pulled something in my back. Getting old is no fun, especially when people are shoving you around in the dark. But I was okay. Bruised, scared, but okay. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the barn. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on that mound of dirt in the corner. Except it wasn't a mound anymore. Someone had been digging. There was a hole now, maybe 3 feet deep, and dirt was scattered everywhere. The tin box I'd seen earlier stuck out even more now, its corner fully exposed. But they hadn't taken it. Whoever it was had run away before they could finish the job, which meant they'd be back. I walked closer, my phone light shaking because my hands were shaking. The barn felt different now, violated somehow, like a grave that had been disturbed. I knelt down beside the hole, ignoring the pain in my back, and touched the tin box with my fingertips. It was real. Cool metal, rough with rust, the kind of box people used to store important documents before we had safety deposit boxes and fireproof safes. The kind of box someone would use if they were burying something they never intended to dig up again. I tried to pull it free, but it was stuck, wedged in tight by decades of settled earth. I'd need a shovel. I'd need time. I'd need daylight and courage I wasn't sure I had. But as I started to stand up, my phone light caught something else. Carved into the wooden support beam right next to the hole, so faint I almost missed it, were initials. HL plus RL. Howard Langston and Ruth Langston. And underneath, a date. August 15th, 1983. The night before we left the ranch forever. I went back to my car and waited for sunrise, which took another 3 hours that felt like 3 years. My shoulder ached from where the door had hit me, and every time I closed my eyes I saw those initials carved into the wood. HL plus RL. What did that mean? Why would Howard carve his name next to his sister's name on the night before we abandoned everything? The questions circled in my head like vultures, picking at my sanity. By the time the sun came up, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, I'd made a decision. I was going to dig up that box, whatever it took. I was going to find out what Howard had hidden, why someone else wanted it badly enough to come here in the middle of the night, and what any of this had to do with Ruth. I drove back into Maryville and bought a shovel at the hardware store, along with work gloves and a bottle of water I drank in the parking lot. The same old man from yesterday was working the register, and he looked at the shovel, then at me, and I could see him putting the pieces together in his head. "You find what you're looking for yet?" he asked. "Working on it." He nodded slowly. Ruth Langston passed away last month. Saw it in the obituary. Lived in Phoenix the last 30 years. Left behind 2 daughters and a mess of grandkids. My hands went cold. I didn't know. No reason you would, I suppose. Hadn't seen her around these parts since the 80s. Heard she did pretty well for herself in the city. He paused, wrapping my shovel in brown paper, like that would somehow disguise what it was. Heard she left behind some debts too. The kind that make people go looking for money in strange places. I thought about that silver SUV, about the footprints in the barn, about someone desperate enough to break into an abandoned ranch in the middle of the night. Her family know about the ranch? I asked. Wouldn't surprise me if they did. Small towns got long memories and people talk. He handed me my change, his ancient fingers brushing mine. Be careful out there, Mrs. Langston. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. The drive back felt shorter this time, maybe because I knew what I was driving toward. When I pulled up to the gate, I half expected to see that silver SUV waiting for me, but the ranch was empty. Just me and the ghosts and whatever truth was buried in that barn. I grabbed the shovel and headed straight for the hole. No more hesitation. No more fear. I'd come this far, and I wasn't leaving without answers. The digging was harder than I expected. The earth was packed down tight from 40 years of settling, and every shovelful sent pain shooting through my shoulder where I'd been hit last night. But I kept going, working steadily, methodically, the way Howard had taught me to work when we were rebuilding after the flood. Sweat dripped into my eyes. My back screamed at me to stop. But I could feel that box getting closer with every dig, could sense I was about to uncover something that would change everything. It took an hour. Maybe two. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the shovel, the dirt, and the slowly emerging tin box that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than some people live. When I finally freed it, I sat back on my heels, breathing hard, staring at this thing that had brought me back across 40 years and 6 hours of highway. It was bigger than I'd thought, maybe the size of a large shoebox, and heavier too when I lifted it out. The lid was sealed with rust and dirt, but I managed to pry it open with the edge of the shovel. The hinges squealed like something dying. Inside, wrapped in rotted burlap and tied with wire that crumbled at my touch, were 3 bundles of $100 bills. Old bills, the kind they don't print anymore, yellowed with age, but still good. I didn't count them, but there had to be thousands of dollars here. Maybe tens of thousands. And underneath the money, a locket I recognized immediately. Silver, heart-shaped, with a tiny clasp that had always been tricky to open. Howard had given it to me on our wedding day, and I'd worn it every day for years until the chain broke and I'd put it away in a drawer and somehow never got around to fixing it. But I hadn't seen it in decades. Since before we left the ranch. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a photo of us on our wedding day, young and stupid, and so in love it hurt to look at. But on the back, in Howard's handwriting, were words I'd never seen before. For what I couldn't say then. What couldn't he say? What was so terrible that he had to bury his feelings along with stolen money? Because that's what this was, wasn't it? Stolen money. There was no other explanation for why it would be hidden like this. But stolen from who?
And why?
I dug deeper into the box, and my fingers found one more thing. An envelope, addressed in Howard's neat printing to Ruth Langston. A letter he'd written to his sister, but never sent. Or maybe he'd sent it in a different way, by burying it here, where she'd never find it, a message meant for the grave. I pulled it out with trembling fingers and unfolded the paper inside. The ink had faded, but the words were still readable, and as I read them, the whole ugly truth of 1983 finally came into focus. Ruth, it began, I know what you did. Ruth, I know what you did. You forged my signature on that loan and took the ranch's deeds. I couldn't prove it then, and Maggie didn't believe me when I told her you'd ruin us. But I buried your confession under the land you tried to steal, and when I'm gone, the truth will find daylight. I took back what was ours. You won't see me again. HL. The letter fell from my hands and landed in the dirt beside the money. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to make my brain accept what my eyes had just read. Ruth had stolen our ranch. She'd forged Howard's signature, taken out loans in his name, destroyed his reputation, and driven us away from the only home we'd ever loved. And Howard had known. He'd known the whole time. But he'd never told me, never fought back, never defended himself against the rumors that tore through town like wildfire. He'd just packed up our lives and left, carrying this secret like a stone around his neck for 40 years.
Why?
Why would he protect her? Why would he let me think he was weak, that he'd failed us, that we were running away from his mistakes, when really we were running from her crime? I remembered the fights we'd had that last year. Me begging him to explain what happened, to tell me the truth about the debts, about the accusations. Him shutting down, going silent, drinking too much and staring at nothing. The distance that grew between us, cold and wide as a winter river. "Tell me what's going on," I'd said one night, finding him on the porch at 2 a.m. with an empty bottle beside him. "Tell me how to help you." "You can't help," he'd said, not even looking at me. "Nobody can. Some things are just broken, Maggie, and you gotta let them stay broken." But he hadn't let it stay broken. He'd taken the money, Ruth's money, probably from the loans she'd stolen in his name, and he'd buried it here along with the evidence of what she'd done. He'd buried it and walked away, knowing that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. The year was 1983, and it was the worst year of my life until Howard died and made it compete for that title. We'd been struggling financially. That part was true. Cattle prices had dropped, and we'd had a bad winter that killed off a third of our herd. We needed help, and Ruth had shown up like an answer to prayer. Except she wasn't an answer. She was the problem disguised as the solution. I remembered her sitting at our kitchen table, going over paperwork with Howard while I made coffee neither of them drank. She had this way of talking that made everything sound reasonable. We'd sign here, she'd co-sign there, the bank would give us enough to get through the next year, and we'd pay it all back when things turned around. Howard had been reluctant. I could see it in the way he held the pen without signing, in the way he kept reading the same paragraph over and over. "I don't know, Ruth. This doesn't feel right." "Don't be stubborn," she'd said, smiling that smile that never reached her eyes. "This is what family does. We help each other." But he'd said no. I remembered that clearly now, the memory surfacing like something that had been underwater too long. He'd pushed the papers back across the table and said, "Thanks, but we'll figure it out ourselves." And 2 weeks later, the sheriff showed up with foreclosure notices. The bank claimed Howard had defaulted on loans I'd never heard of. Papers surfaced with his signature, papers he swore he'd never signed. Our lawyer said we could fight it, but it would take years and money we didn't have, and in the meantime, we'd lose everything anyway. The town turned on us fast. People we'd known for years started crossing the street to avoid us. The looks we got at church, at the grocery store, everywhere we went, judgment mixed with pity mixed with satisfaction that the proud Langston boy had finally fallen. And through it all, Ruth played the concerned sister. She'd show up with casseroles and sympathy, talking about how hard this must be, how she'd tried to help but Howard had refused her, making herself look like a saint while she twisted the knife. Howard never said a word against her. Not one word. He took all the blame, wore all the shame, and when we finally left in the middle of the night with everything we owned packed in the back of our truck, he looked back at the ranch one time and said, "One day, the truth will dig itself out." I hadn't understood then. Thought he was just talking nonsense, trying to make himself feel better about giving up. But he'd been telling me exactly what would happen, that one day, I'd come back here and dig up the truth he'd buried. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been lying to protect you? That your whole understanding of a major event in your life was completely wrong? Drop a comment and share your story, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around mine. The money in that box wasn't stolen from us. It was stolen by Ruth, in our name, and Howard had taken it back. Taken it and hidden it where she'd never think to look, in the ground of the ranch she'd tried to steal. And now, 40 years later, someone was looking for it. Ruth's family probably, desperate for money their grandmother had told them about before she died. Money she'd said was hidden at the old Langston place, money that belonged to them. Except it didn't. It never had. This money, this land, this whole story, it was ours. It had always been ours. I looked down at the letter again, at Howard's angry, careful handwriting, and something inside me shifted. All those years I'd carried resentment, thinking Howard had been too proud or too weak to fight for our home. All those nights I'd lain awake wondering if I'd married the wrong man, if I'd wasted my life on someone who gave up when things got hard. And he'd been protecting me the whole time. Protecting me from the truth about his sister, from the ugliness of family betrayal, from having to choose between him and blood. He'd carried that burden alone because he loved me too much to make me carry it with him. The sun was high now, beating down on the barn, and I was 72 years old sitting in the dirt with tears running down my face, finally understanding the man I'd buried 3 weeks ago. "You fool," I whispered to the ghost of him. "You beautiful, stubborn fool." But there was no time for grief. Because as I sat there with the tin box open beside me and the evidence of Ruth's crime in my hands, I heard the sound of tires on the dirt road leading to the ranch. The silver SUV was coming back. And this time, I had a feeling whoever was driving it wasn't going to run away. The SUV pulled up to the gate and stopped, the engine idling for a moment before shutting off. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, the letter still in my hand. Through the barn door, I could see a woman getting out of the driver's side, tall, well-dressed, the kind of person who looked like she'd never had dirt under her fingernails in her life. She was young, maybe 30, with Ruth's sharp cheekbones and that same smile I'd never trusted. Family. Had to be. I walked out of the barn to meet her, and she stopped when she saw me, her smile faltering just a little.
Good.
Let her be uncertain. Let her wonder what I knew. "Mrs. Langston?" she called out, her voice friendly and fake as artificial sweetener. "I'm Delaney Harris. Ruth Langston was my grandmother." "I know who Ruth was," I said, not moving closer. "What I don't know is what you're doing on my property." She laughed like I'd made a joke. "Your property?" "Mrs. Langston, I think there's been some confusion. This land was in my family before. Before your grandmother stole it from my husband, you mean?" That stopped her cold. The smile disappeared completely, replaced by something harder, more calculating. She took a few steps closer, and I could see she was carrying a folder full of papers. "I don't know what you think you know," she said carefully, "but my grandmother told me the real story before she died. How your husband took out loans he couldn't pay back, how he tried to blame her when everything fell apart. She tried to help you, tried to save the ranch, and he repaid her by disappearing with money that didn't belong to him." "Is that what she told you?" I held up the letter. "Because your grandmother was a liar and a thief, and I've got the proof right here." Delaney's eyes locked onto the paper in my hand, and I saw hunger flash across her face. "Where did you get that?" "Same place I got the money your grandmother stole. The money she told you about before she died, I'm guessing. The money she said was hidden out here, that rightfully belonged to her." I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Except it never did. This money, this land, it was stolen from us, and my husband spent 40 years making sure the truth wouldn't die with him. She set the folder down on the hood of her SUV and crossed her arms. "You can't prove any of that. My grandmother is dead. Your husband is dead. It's your word against hers, and frankly, Mrs. Langston, the paper trail supports her version." "The paper trail she forged, you mean?" "Forged is a strong accusation." Delaney pulled out her phone, tapping on the screen. "My family has documentation of every loan, every transaction. We have lawyers who'd be very interested in filing claims against the estate, especially now that we know money from those loans has been recovered." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. This woman, this entitled child who hadn't lived through what we'd lived through, who hadn't lost everything because of her grandmother's greed, was standing on my land, threatening me with lawyers and lies. You want to take this to court? I asked. Be my guest. I've got Howard's letter. I've got the money he took back from your grandmother. And I've got 40 years of testimony about how Ruth destroyed our lives and walked away clean. You think a judge won't be interested in reopening that case? Delaney's jaw tightened. My grandmother made mistakes, okay? I'm not saying she was perfect. But she's gone now, and whatever happened back then, it's done. The question is what happens next. She paused, trying on a different approach. Look, we could fight about this for years. Or we could come to an agreement. You keep the land, we split the money. Everyone walks away happy. I don't want her happiness. I want justice. Justice. She actually laughed. You're 72 years old. How much justice do you think you're going to get before you end up in the ground next to your husband? This isn't about justice. It's about pride. And pride doesn't pay bills. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was too old for this fight. Maybe the smart thing was to give her half the money and let the past stay buried. But then I thought about Howard, carrying his secret for 40 years. About the shame he'd worn like a coat he couldn't take off. About all the things we'd lost. Not just the ranch, but our reputation, our place in the community, our son's childhood home. And I thought about Ruth, living comfortable in Phoenix all those years while we struggled in a cramped apartment, Howard working jobs he hated because ranching was the only thing he'd ever loved and she'd taken that from him. No, I said simply. No deal. Delaney's pleasant mask finally cracked completely. You're making a mistake. My family has resources. We have lawyers who'd eat you alive. We'll tie this up in court for years, and you'll spend every penny you have fighting us. Then I guess we'll be fighting. I walked back toward the barn, done with this conversation. And Delaney? Next time you come onto my property without permission, I'm calling the sheriff. We're done here. I heard her get back in her SUV, heard the engine start. But before she drove away, she rolled down her window and called out, My grandmother used to say your husband was weak. That he gave up without a fight. Guess she was wrong about that. The SUV kicked up dust as it drove away, and I stood there holding Howard's letter, thinking about what she'd said. Ruth had thought Howard was weak. Hell, I'd thought he was weak. But taking this kind of stand, making this kind of sacrifice, carrying this burden alone for decades, that wasn't weakness. That was the strongest thing I'd ever seen. I went back into the barn and carefully gathered everything. The money, the locket, the letter. Then I carried the tin box to my car and locked it in the trunk. Whatever happened next, I needed to keep this evidence safe. As I walked back to the house, my phone rang. Calvin's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mom? Where are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning. I'm at the ranch, honey. I'm sorry, I should have called. There was a long pause. The ranch? Mom, you said you were just going to meet with a realtor. What's going on? How could I explain this? How could I tell him that everything we'd believed about why we left, about his father's supposed failure, had been a lie? Your dad left me something, I said finally. Something I needed to find. I'll explain everything when I get home. But Calvin, your father wasn't who we thought he was. He was better. So much better. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, you're scaring me. Don't be scared. For the first time in 40 years, I'm finally seeing things clearly. I looked at the ranch, at the sagging house and the broken barn and the land that had witnessed so much pain. Your grandmother Ruth stole this place from us. Your father knew it, and he made sure I'd find proof. He made sure the truth would survive. Grandma Ruth? Calvin's voice went tight. Mom, what are you talking about? Come down here, I said. Come see where you were born, and I'll tell you the whole story. It's time you knew who your father really was. After we hung up, I sat on the porch steps, the same steps where Howard and I used to watch sunsets, where we talked about our dreams for this place, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The truth was out. The fight was just beginning. And somewhere, I like to think Howard was finally resting easy, knowing his silence had been broken and his name would be cleared. But as the sun started to set, painting the sky in colors that looked exactly like they had 40 years ago, I saw headlights in the distance. Not Calvin, he couldn't get here that fast. Not Delaney, she'd already played her hand. Someone else was coming. And whatever happened next, I was ready for it. The headlights belonged to a county sheriff's truck, and for a moment my heart jumped into my throat. Had Delaney called them? Was I about to be arrested for trespassing on my own property, for taking back money that Ruth had stolen in the first place? But when the sheriff got out, he was old, older than me probably, and he moved slowly like his bones hurt. He took off his hat as he approached, which seemed like a good sign. Mrs. Langston? Margaret Langston. That's me. I stood up from the porch steps, trying to read his face. Is there a problem, officer? Sheriff Tom Brennan. I knew your husband years back, before you folks left. He looked around at the ranch, and something sad crossed his face. Hell of a thing, what happened here. You knew Howard? Not well, but I was a deputy back in '83, fresh out of the academy, when all that business with the loans went down. My boss at the time, Sheriff Patterson, he's dead now, he always said something wasn't right about that case. Said the paperwork looked funny, but the bank didn't want to investigate and your husband didn't want to fight. He met my eyes. Always bothered me, that did. Good man like Howard, just giving up without a word. My throat went tight. He wasn't giving up. He was protecting me. Sheriff Brennan nodded slowly. I believe that. Which is why I'm here. Got a call this afternoon from a woman named Delaney Harris, claiming you'd assaulted her and stolen property from her grandmother's estate. Wanted me to come arrest you. My hands clenched into fists. That's a lie. She came here trying to claim money that never belonged to her family in the first place. I figured as much. Miss Harris didn't know I'd been waiting 30 years for someone to finally tell the truth about what happened to the Langstons. He pulled out a notebook from his pocket. You mind telling me your version of events?
So I did.
I told him everything about Howard's letter, about the tin box buried in the barn, about Ruth's confession, and the forged documents. I showed him the letter Howard had written, and I watched his face change as he read it. Son of a... He stopped himself, shaking his head. I knew it. I knew there was something wrong with that case. But I was just a kid, and nobody wanted to hear what some rookie deputy thought about the Langston situation. He looked at me with something like admiration. You're saying you've got proof Ruth Langston forged your husband's signature on those loan documents? Howard said he had proof. It's in that letter. This letter would be a good start, but we'd need more to reopen a case this old. Bank records, handwriting analysis, testimony from people who were around at the time. He paused, thinking. The statute of limitations on fraud in this state is 7 years, so we couldn't press criminal charges against Ruth even if she was alive. But for civil purposes, for clearing your husband's name and establishing rightful ownership of this property, this could work. Hope flared in my chest, bright and painful. You mean we could prove Howard was innocent? That Ruth was the one who committed fraud? Possible. Can't promise anything, but I'd be willing to look into it, especially now that the Harris family is making noise about claiming property. That gives us legal grounds to investigate the original transactions. He handed the letter back to me. But I gotta warn you, Mrs. Langston. This kind of thing, it gets ugly fast. The Harris family will lawyer up. They'll try to discredit you, say you're a grieving widow inventing stories. They'll drag this through court for years if they have to.
Let them, I said.
The words came out stronger than I felt. My husband lived with a lie for 40 years because he thought protecting me was more important than protecting himself. The least I can do is fight for his truth now that he's gone. Sheriff Brennan smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. Your husband was a lucky man, having someone willing to go to war for him. No, I said softly. I was the lucky one. After the sheriff left with copies of Howard's letter and a statement from me about finding the buried box, I went inside the house for the first time. It was worse than I'd imagined: water damage, animal droppings, 40 years of neglect turning everything we'd built into rot and ruin. But under all that decay, I could still see us. The kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 meals. The living room where Calvin took his first steps. The bedroom where Howard and I had talked late into the night about dreams that seemed possible back then. I found an old photo album in the closet, its pages stuck together with moisture and time. But I carefully pulled them apart, and there we were, young and stupid, and so sure we had forever. Howard with his arm around me at our wedding. Calvin as a baby, chubby and laughing. The three of us standing in front of the barn on Christmas morning, snow on the ground and pure joy on our faces. When had we stopped being those people? When had life gotten so hard that we forgot how to be happy? Thunder rumbled in the distance, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked out the window and saw dark clouds rolling in, the kind of storm that turns day to night in minutes. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the walls, and I felt the temperature drop. I should have left. Should have gotten in my car and driven back to town before the storm hit. But something kept me there, standing in that ruined house, watching the lightning flash across the sky. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was grief. Or maybe I just needed to spend one more night in this place, to say goodbye to the life we'd had before Ruth destroyed it. The storm hit hard and fast. Rain came down in sheets, pounding the roof so loud I couldn't hear myself think. The power had been disconnected years ago, so I sat in darkness broken only by lightning flashes that lit up the room like camera flashes, freezing everything in stark white light. And in one of those flashes, I saw something I'd missed before. There, on the wall above the fireplace, was a loose board. Not obviously loose. You'd only notice if you were looking for it. But it was there, just slightly out of alignment with the others. I walked over and pulled on it. It came away easily, and behind it was a space about a foot deep. And in that space was another envelope, this one addressed to me in Howard's handwriting. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The date on it was August 14th, 1983, the day before we left. My darling Maggie, it began, and I had to stop reading because tears were blurring the words. I wiped my eyes and continued. If you're reading this, then you came back like I hoped you would. You found the truth about Ruth, and I hope you can forgive me for keeping it from you all these years. I know you thought I was weak. I saw it in your eyes every time you looked at me after we left the ranch. And I lived with that because it was easier than telling you what your sister-in-law really was. But I want you to know, I didn't give up. I never gave up. I just chose a different kind of fight. The kind that takes patience and faith and a willingness to look like a coward so the person you love can stay innocent. I'm sorry for the life we lost. I'm sorry for the dreams we had to abandon. But I'm not sorry for protecting you from the worst of it. That's what love is, Maggie. It's not grand gestures or perfect words. It's carrying the heavy things alone so your partner doesn't have to. Thank you for 50 years. Thank you for believing in me even when I couldn't believe in myself. And thank you for coming back to finish what I started. The ranch is yours again. The truth is yours. Do with them what you will. All my love, always and forever, Howard. Lightning flashed, thunder crashed, and I sat on the floor of our old house holding that letter and crying like I hadn't cried since the day we buried him. Howard had left me a second letter. A private one. One that wasn't about Ruth or money or justice. It was just about us. About love and sacrifice and the quiet way good people carry pain so others don't have to. The storm raged outside, but inside that house, I finally found peace. Because I finally understood what Howard had been trying to tell me all along. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is appear weak. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay silent. And sometimes love means carrying secrets to the grave, trusting that someday, somehow, The person who matters most will understand why. The rain pounded the roof, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a vehicle approaching through the storm. Not the sheriff this time, and not Delaney. This time, it was Calvin, my son, coming home to the ranch he barely remembered, ready to hear the truth about his father at last. Calvin came through that door soaking wet and looking scared, and when he saw me sitting on the floor with letters scattered around me and tears on my face, he nearly had a heart attack.
Mom.
Jesus, are you okay? What happened? I stood up, bones creaking, and pulled my son into a hug. He was 52 years old, but right then he felt like that 12-year-old boy crying in the back of our truck, asking why we had to leave. And this time, I had an answer for him. Your father, I said into his shoulder, was the best man I ever knew, and I'm about to tell you why. We sat there on the dusty floor while the storm raged outside, and I told him everything. About Ruth's betrayal, about the forged documents, about the money Howard had taken back and buried as evidence. About the 40 years he'd carried that secret alone, letting people think the worst of him so I wouldn't have to face the truth about his sister. Calvin listened without interrupting, and I watched his face change as the story unfolded. Anger first, then disbelief, then finally something that looked like understanding mixed with grief. All this time, he said when I finished, all this time I thought Dad just gave up. I thought he quit on us.
On you.
On everything. His voice broke. I was so angry at him. Even after he died, I was still angry. I know, baby. I was too. But he didn't quit. Calvin stopped, trying to find the words. He sacrificed everything. His reputation, his home, his relationship with us. Because he didn't want you to know what Aunt Ruth had done. That's exactly what he did. Calvin picked up one of the letters, reading it in the dim light from his phone. Why didn't he just tell you? Why didn't he fight back? Because he knew me, I said simply. He knew I'd want to confront her, to tell everyone what she'd done. And back then, with no proof and her word against his, it would have torn the family apart for nothing. So he took the hit. He let himself be the villain in everyone's story so Ruth would think she'd won and move on with her life. Calvin shook his head. That's insane. That's the most loving, stupid, noble thing I've ever heard. That was your father. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Finally, Calvin said, What happens now? Are you going to sue Ruth's family? Try to get justice after all these years. The sheriff says we can reopen the case. Prove the fraud, clear your father's name, establish that this property was always legally ours. I looked around at the ruined house, at everything we'd lost. But honestly, Cal, I don't know if I have the energy for that fight. Then what was the point? His voice was frustrated, almost angry. Dad kept this secret for 40 years. He sent you back here to find the truth. If you don't do anything with it, if you just let it go. The point, I interrupted gently, was that I needed to know. Not the world. Not a judge.
Me.
I needed to understand why we left, why your father changed, why our marriage almost broke under the weight of something I didn't even know we were carrying. I touched Calvin's face the way I used to when he was small. And now I do. Now I can forgive him for all the things I blamed him for. Now I can love him the way he deserved to be loved, even if it's too late for him to know it. Calvin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, The ranch was always yours, Mrs. Langston. I blinked. What? That's what the sheriff said when he called me on my way here. He ran the property records, traced everything back. Ruth's fraud attempt failed. The bank eventually figured out something was wrong with the loan documents, and when they couldn't collect, they wrote it off rather than pursue legal action. The property title never actually changed hands. It's been in your name this whole time. Yours and Dad's. You just didn't know it. The world seemed to tilt sideways. This land is ours. Has been for 40 years. You could have come back any time. You could have reclaimed it, rebuilt it, done whatever you wanted. Dad must have known. That's probably why he was so specific in his letter about telling you to come here. He wanted you to know you hadn't lost everything. That Ruth didn't win. I couldn't speak.
Couldn't think.
The ranch was ours. Had always been ours. We'd spent 4 decades living in cramped apartments, working jobs we hated, convinced we'd lost our home forever, and all along, it was sitting here waiting for us to come back. Mom, Calvin's voice was gentle. What do you want to do? What did I want to do? I looked around at the house falling apart around us, at the land visible through the broken windows, at the ghost of the life we could have had. I want to plant flowers, I said finally. Wild flowers. Where the cattle used to graze. I want to put up a sign that says Langston Ranch, so everyone who drives by knows this land is still ours. And I want to bring your father's ashes here and scatter them in the field where he proposed to me, so he can finally come home. Calvin smiled through his tears. He'd like that. And then, I continued, I want to walk away. Let the land go back to nature. Let it be peaceful. Not a working ranch, not a tourist attraction, just a quiet place where truth rests easy and secrets don't have to be buried anymore. What about Ruth's family? Delaney and whoever else is sniffing around for money. Let them try. The sheriff has Dad's letter, has the evidence of Ruth's fraud. If they want to fight, they'll lose. And when they do, I'll make sure everyone knows what Ruth Langston really was. Not for revenge, just so the record is straight. So Dad's name is cleared, and people remember him the way he deserved to be remembered. The storm was passing, the thunder moving off into the distance. Through the window, I could see the first stars appearing in the clearing sky. You know what the crazy thing is? Calvin said. I don't really remember living here. I was so young when we left, but I remember Dad being different before, being happy in a way he never was again. And I remember you being different too. We were younger, simpler. No, Calvin shook his head. You were whole. This place made you whole, and leaving it broke something in both of you that never healed. He was right. The ranch wasn't just land. It was the dream we'd built together, the future we'd planned, the proof that hard work and love could create something lasting. Losing it had been like losing a child, a grief we carried for the rest of our lives. But Howard had made sure I'd find my way back, had made sure I'd know the truth. And in doing that, he'd given me something more valuable than the property or the money or even justice. He'd given me understanding. And understanding, I was learning, was its own kind of peace. Calvin and I spent that night in the house, talking about his father, sharing memories, filling in the gaps in both our histories. And when the sun came up, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber, we walked out to the field together, and I showed him where Howard and I used to watch sunsets. This is where he asked me to marry him, I said. Right here, with the sun going down and the cattle calling and the whole world feeling like it was ours for the taking. Was it? Calvin asked. Did you get to take it? For a little while, I said. For 12 beautiful years. And that's more than a lot of people get. 2 weeks later, the county courthouse confirmed what Sheriff Brennan had discovered. The ranch was legally ours, had been all along. Ruth's fraud had been documented, her attempt to steal the property had failed, and Howard's name was officially cleared of all the accusations that had driven us away. Delaney and her family tried to contest it, tried to claim rights to the money in the tin box, but their lawyers took one look at the evidence and advised them to drop it. Whatever Ruth had told them before she died was lies built on 40 years of pretending she hadn't destroyed her brother's life. I didn't gloat, didn't rub it in their faces. Just signed the papers that confirmed my ownership, took the cleared title, and let it be finished. The truth had done what truth always does eventually. It survived. Spring came to the ranch in shades of purple and yellow and red, wildflowers pushing up through soil that hadn't seen planting in 40 years. I hired someone to put up a new sign at the gate, simple and clean. Langston Ranch, where honesty rests easy. I brought Howard's ashes on a Sunday in April, when the desert was at its most beautiful. Calvin came with me and his wife and their 3 kids who'd never met their grandfather, but who listened carefully when I told them what kind of man he was. We scattered his ashes in that field where he'd proposed, where we'd watched 1,000 sunsets together, where we dreamed dreams that got stolen but never quite died. And as the wind carried him across the land he'd loved, I whispered the words I wish I'd said before he left. You were right to keep your silence. Some justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to outlast the lies.
You did that.
You won. And I love you more now than I ever did when you were alive, because now I understand what love really means. I visit every spring, when the flowers are at their peak. I walk the fields, I sit on the porch of the house I'll never repair, and I talk to Howard like he's still here beside me. Maybe he is. Maybe some places hold on to the people who love them, keep them close even after they're gone. The ranch doesn't look like much to people driving by. Just another piece of abandoned property in a dying region, slowly being reclaimed by nature.
But I know what it really is.
It's proof that truth has patience. That love makes sacrifices nobody else can see. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is appear weak, and the bravest thing you can do is carry someone else's burden so they don't have to. I'm 73 now, and I don't know how many more springs I have left to see these flowers bloom. But I know that when my time comes, Calvin will scatter my ashes here beside his father's. We'll finally be home again, together, on the land that witnessed our love story from beginning to end. And maybe, just maybe, the wind will carry our story to other people who need to hear it. People who think their partner has failed them, who think their marriage is broken beyond repair, who think they know the whole truth when they're only seeing the surface of things. Because here's what I learned in that barn, digging through 40 years of buried secrets with my bare hands. The people we love are mysteries we spend our whole lives trying to solve. And sometimes, we don't get the answers until they're gone. But that doesn't mean the answers weren't always there, waiting in the ground like seeds, ready to bloom when the time was right. Howard carried his secret like a soldier carries a wound from war, quietly, without complaint, believing the pain was his to bear alone. He never asked for credit, never demanded I understand. He just loved me the best way he knew how, which was to protect me from the ugliness he saw coming.
And Ruth?
She died thinking she'd won. Died believing she'd gotten away with destroying her brother and stealing his legacy. But graves don't keep secrets forever. The earth has a way of giving up what's buried in it, and truth is patient enough to wait for the right person to come digging. I sold the money from the tin box. Turned out to be $43,000, which was a fortune in 1983, but just enough now to set up a small scholarship fund at the local high school. The Howard Langston Memorial Scholarship, for kids who want to study agriculture or ranching, who still believe in the dignity of working the land. The first recipient was a girl from Maryville whose family had lost their farm in foreclosure, just like we almost did. When I shook her hand at the ceremony, I saw something in her eyes that reminded me of young Howard. Determination mixed with hope, the belief that hard work and honesty could still mean something in this world. Your husband must have been quite a man, she said to me. The best, I told her. Took me 40 years to realize it, but the best. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. Angry at Ruth for what she did, angry at Howard for keeping secrets, angry at myself for not seeing the truth sooner. And I tell them no, I'm not angry anymore. Anger is exhausting, and I'm too old to carry it around. What I feel instead is grateful. Grateful that I got 50 years with a man who loved me enough to sacrifice everything. Grateful that I lived long enough to learn the truth. Grateful that justice, even when it comes slow and quiet, still comes. The ranch sits empty most of the year now, but it's not forgotten. Hikers sometimes stop to take pictures of the wildflowers. Photographers come at sunset to capture the way the light hits the old barn. And sometimes, local kids sneak through the fence to explore, looking for adventure in the ruins. I don't mind. Let them come. Let them wonder about the people who lived here, the stories these walls could tell. Let them see that some places refuse to disappear, no matter how hard the world tries to erase them. Every spring, like clockwork, I open that gate again. And it doesn't groan anymore. I fixed the hinges last year, oiled them until they swung smooth and silent. Because I'm not waking the ranch from sleep anymore. I'm just coming home. I walk the paths Howard and I used to walk, my steps slower now but following the same routes. Past the corral, where we used to keep the horses. Through the field where Calvin learned to ride. Up to the small rise where you can see for miles in every direction, where everything looks possible and the future feels like something you can reach out and touch. And I talk to Howard. Tell him about Calvin's kids growing up, about the grandson who wants to be a veterinarian, about the granddaughter who writes poetry that would make him cry. Tell him about the scholarship, about Delaney giving up her claim, about the quiet way justice rolled out across the years until truth was all that remained. You did it, I tell him, standing there with wildflowers up to my knees and the wind carrying the smell of sage and rain. You protected me, you protected your name, and you made sure I'd find my way back. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can hear him answer. Not with words exactly, but with something deeper than words. The kind of communication that happens between people who've loved each other long enough to speak without speaking, to know without knowing. He tells me he'd do it all again. Every sacrifice, every silent year, every moment of being misunderstood. He tells me it was worth it, that love isn't about being understood. It's about understanding that some things are bigger than our own comfort, our own need to be seen as righteous. He tells me he's proud of me for coming back, for digging up the truth, for letting the flowers grow where the pain used to be. And he tells me he's waiting, that wherever he is now, there's a gate there too, and one day I'll walk through it and he'll be standing on the other side, young again and smiling, ready to show me all the sunsets I missed while we were apart. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in those impossible colors that make you believe in something bigger than yourself. I sit down in the wildflowers, my old bones grateful for the rest, and I watch the light change the way Howard and I used to watch it together. This is peace. This is what comes after the storm. This is what it feels like when secrets stop being weapons and become just stories, sad ones maybe, painful ones definitely, but stories nonetheless. Things that happened to people who did their best with what they had. I'm 73 years old, and I finally understand what Howard was trying to tell me in that letter. Love isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition or praise. It just carries on day after day, doing what needs to be done, trusting that someday, somehow, the people who matter will understand why. He was right about something else too. Some land is meant to forgive. This land forgave us for leaving, forgave us for staying away so long, welcomed us back when we finally found the courage to open the gate and walk through. Now it's my turn to forgive, Howard for his secrets, Ruth for her cruelty, myself for my blindness. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes what the past does to the future. And I want my future, however much of it I have left, to be about growth instead of grief, about flowers instead of graves. The last light is fading now, stars appearing one by one like promises being kept. I stand up slowly, brush the dirt and petals from my clothes, and walk back toward the gate. My ranch, my truth. Tomorrow I'll lock it behind me and drive back to the city. But I'll return next spring, and the spring after that, and every spring the good Lord gives me. Because this place isn't just property anymore. It's not just dirt and memories and ghosts. It's proof that love survives everything, betrayal, distance, death, time itself. It's proof that honor matters, even when nobody's watching. It's proof that some battles are worth fighting even if you never live to see the victory. And it's proof that gates, no matter how rusted or heavy or stuck they seem, can always be opened again if you're brave enough to cut through the chains and walk through. So, if you've got a gate in your life that you swore you'd never open, maybe this story, will give you the courage to try. If you've got secrets buried in your past that need digging up, maybe you'll find a shovel and start working. And if you've got someone you loved who died before you could tell them you finally understood, well, tell them anyway. They'll hear you. I'm sure of it. Because love doesn't end at graves, and truth doesn't die with the people who kept it. They just wait, patient as wildflowers, for the right season to bloom. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If Maggie's story touched your heart, if it made you think about the people in your life who carry burdens you can't see, then please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this story in the comments. Tell us about someone who sacrificed for you in ways you didn't understand until later. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And remember, justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just whispers through wildflowers, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Until next time, take care of each other, love hard, fight for truth, and never be afraid to open gates you thought were closed forever. Because you never know what's waiting on the other side. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.